Daniel had always felt an undeniable bond with the wilderness. The towering trees, the crisp mountain air, and the rhythmic sounds of nature gave him a sense of peace that nothing else in the world could offer. He had spent years exploring these forests, moving through their winding paths with an ease that only experience could provide. This was his sanctuary, his escape from the pressures of modern life. But today something felt off. The usual harmony of the woods was replaced by an unsettling stillness, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The morning had begun like any other. Daniel packed lightly, bringing only the essentials: water, protein bars, a small first aid kit, and his trusted knife. He ventured deep into uncharted territory, eager to discover new trails and untouched beauty. But the further he went, the more unfamiliar his surroundings became. There were no signs of human presence, no footprints in the damp earth, no broken branches indicating that anyone had passed through. Normally, this kind of solitude was what he sought, but today it sent a chill up his spine. As he carefully descended a narrow slope, a faint, pitiful sound reached his ears. It was barely audible over the rustling leaves, yet there was something undeniably distressed about it. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, a weak whimper, soft and trembling. His instincts kicked in, drawing him toward the source. Near the riverbank, nestled among the roots of a massive oak tree, he saw it, a small bear cub, curled up tightly, shivering. Its fur was matted with dirt, and its ribs were faintly visible beneath its thin frame. It looked weak, fragile, and completely alone. Daniel's gaze swept the area, searching for any sign of the mother, but the forest remained eerily silent. A cub this young should not have been by itself. Bear mothers were fiercely protective, never straying far from their young. If she had been nearby, she would have already attacked, sensing Daniel as a threat. But there was nothing, just the cub's lonely whimpering in the vast emptiness of the woods around them. Daniel hesitated. He knew the unspoken rules of the wild. Never interfere with nature, never separate an animal from its habitat. But looking at the cub, so small and helpless, he felt an overwhelming urge to help. Slowly he crouched, extending a hand to earn its trust. The cub did not flinch. It didn't growl or recoil in fear. Instead, it simply lifted its head, meeting his gaze with wide, dark eyes, as if it had been waiting for him. A strange chill ran down his spine. Something about this moment felt unnatural. The cub wasn't acting like a wild animal. There was no panic, no instinct to flee. It was almost as if it had expected him to be there. Daniel shook off the unease and focused on the situation at hand. The cub needed food, warmth, and safety. If he left it here, it would not survive the night. The forest was filled with predators, and an abandoned cub was an easy target. Against his better judgment, he made his decision. Gently, he removed his backpack and unzipped it, making room inside. He reached for the cub, expecting it to resist, but to his surprise, it allowed him to lift it without a struggle. It was lighter than he expected, its small body fitting snugly against his chest. He carefully placed it inside the backpack, leaving the zipper open just enough for it to breathe. The cub nestled into the fabric, letting out a soft sigh as if relieved. As Daniel rose to his feet, a heavy silence fell over the forest. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. He turned his head, scanning the trees, but saw nothing beyond the shifting shadows. A creeping unease settled in his gut, but he ignored it. He needed to get back to his cabin before nightfall. With one last glance at the empty riverbank, he adjusted the straps on his shoulders and began the long trek home. Daniel moved swiftly through the dense forest, adjusting his backpack carefully to avoid jostling the cub inside. The weight was barely noticeable, but the responsibility felt immense. His mind raced with questions. Where was the mother? Had she abandoned it? Or worse, had something happened to her? The idea unsettled him. A mother bear would never leave her cub unless something had gone terribly wrong. The trail back to his cabin was familiar, yet the eerie silence made it feel unfamiliar, as if the forest had changed in the short time he had been there. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. It was as if the trees themselves were listening, watching. Daniel felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, but every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw nothing but empty woods. Despite his growing unease, he pressed forward. The cub remained calm in his backpack, barely moving, its breathing steady. It almost seemed too comfortable, too at ease for a wild animal. Daniel dismissed the thought. It was weak, likely exhausted, and he had given it warmth and security. That was all there was to it. As he neared his cabin, the familiar structure came into view through the trees. It was a modest wooden retreat, built for solitude and survival. He had lived here for years, enjoying the peace that came with being disconnected from the world. But today, that solitude felt different. He suddenly wished he was not alone. Stepping inside, he set his backpack down and carefully lifted the cub out. It blinked up at him with wide, unblinking eyes, watching his every move. He placed it on a blanket near the fireplace, lighting a small fire to chase away the evening chill. Hunger. That was the next concern. Daniel rummaged through his supplies, finding a small bottle of milk he kept for emergencies. He warmed it slightly and held it to the cub's mouth. To his relief, it drank without hesitation, its tiny paws gripping his hand. The moment felt oddly intimate, as if the cub was not just an animal, but something more. As the last light of day faded, Daniel sat back and watched the cub, now curled up and resting peacefully. He told himself he would figure things out tomorrow. Maybe take it to a wildlife center, or find someone with more experience in handling orphaned animals. But deep down, he already knew. He was not going to give it up. The cabin felt warm, the fire casting soft shadows across the wooden walls. But outside, beyond the safety of his home, the forest remained unnervingly quiet. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, making Daniel glance up. For a split second, he thought he saw something in the darkness. A shape, a figure. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, pressing his face to the glass, scanning the trees. But there was nothing, just the swaying branches and the empty night. With a sigh, he turned back toward the cub, now sleeping soundly. He was being paranoid. It had been a long day and his mind was playing tricks on him. He needed rest. As he moved toward his bed, the feeling of being watched crept over him again. But this time it did not come from outside. It came from within the cabin, from the cub. Lying on the blanket, its small body rose and fell with steady breaths. But its eyes were open, wide and alert, staring directly at him. Daniel froze. The cub did not blink. Daniel woke to the sound of soft rustling near the fireplace. He had barely slept, his mind restless with unease. Blinking against the dim light of the dying fire, he turned his head toward the cub. It was still curled up on the blanket, but something was off. The way it was breathing, too steady, too controlled. Most animals twitched in their sleep, stirred slightly, made small movements. But this cub remained perfectly still, its small chest rising and falling in an almost deliberate rhythm. Sitting up, he rubbed the fatigue from his eyes and reminded himself he was being irrational. It was just a cub, weak and abandoned. He had done the right thing by bringing it here. He got up and stretched, glancing at the clock. Dawn was creeping in, the soft light filtering through the trees. The forest outside remained unnervingly quiet, as if the world had paused around him. He moved to the kitchen and prepared a small meal, pouring another serving of warm milk into a bowl. When he placed it down, the cub finally moved, stretching its limbs with slow, deliberate motions. Its eyes met his again, those deep, unsettling eyes that felt too knowing for an animal. It padded toward the bowl and began drinking, but not with the frantic hunger of an abandoned cub. Instead, it sipped carefully, controlled, as if it was aware of every movement it made. Daniel exhaled and turned away, trying to shake the discomfort that clung to him. Maybe he had been isolated for too long. Maybe his mind was searching for patterns where none existed. He had taken in a starving animal, nothing more. He needed to stop overthinking. For the rest of the day, he kept a close eye on the cub. It followed him around the cabin, never making a sound. Bears were usually clumsy at this age, but this one moved with an eerie grace, its small body never once stumbling or struggling. At one point, Daniel stepped outside to gather firewood, glancing back to find the cub sitting by the window, staring at him through the glass. Its eyes did not leave him, even as he moved through the yard. The unease deepened. He told himself it was simply curious, that animals observed their surroundings all the time. But he could not ignore the way it looked at him, not like an animal watching its caretaker, but like something studying him. That night, as Daniel sat by the fire, reading an old book, the cub remained near the edge of the room. It did not sleep. It just lay there, still as stone, its eyes half-lidded, but never truly closing. Daniel tried to ignore it, but the weight of its gaze pressed into him. As the hours passed, exhaustion won out. He placed a few more logs into the fireplace, letting the warmth fill the cabin. Just as he was about to retreat to his bed, he heard something, a soft sound, barely audible, a whisper. His body tensed. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the room. The cub remained in the same spot, unmoving. He held his breath, listening. The sound came again, not from outside, from inside. His blood ran cold. It was coming from the cub. He watched frozen as its mouth moved ever so slightly, just enough to make the faintest noise. It was not growling. It was not whimpering. It was something else entirely. Daniel felt an unnatural chill crawl up his spine. He told himself he was imagining it, that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew. Something was not right. He forced himself to move, to turn away, to climb into bed and shut his eyes. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. He tried to sleep, but the whisper lingered, barely there, just on the edge of hearing. And the last thing he saw before exhaustion finally took him was the cub, still lying perfectly still, watching him. Daniel woke with a start, his body covered in a cold sweat. The fire had burned low, casting only faint glows of light across the room. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding, his ears straining for any sound. The cabin was silent, too silent. He turned toward the blanket near the fireplace, expecting to see the cub still curled up there. But it was gone. His stomach twisted as he scanned the room. The door was shut, the windows locked. There was no way it could have gotten out. Slowly he stood, his pulse hammering against his ribs. A flicker of movement in the corner of the room caught his eye, and he turned sharply. The cub sat in the shadows near the far wall, half hidden in the darkness. It did not startle, did not react to his movement. It just sat there staring. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting the fire's embers. The sight sent an unnatural chill through him, but he forced himself to exhale, to shake off the fear creeping up his spine. He was losing it. He was letting his mind twist harmless things into something sinister. It was just an animal, an orphaned cub that did not understand its surroundings. Maybe it had simply wandered in the night and found a new resting spot. But that explanation did not ease the dread that had settled deep in his bones. Pushing aside his unease, Daniel dressed and stepped outside to collect firewood. The morning was cold, the air heavy with moisture. He moved through the trees, his senses unusually alert. He had grown accustomed to the sounds of the forest, but lately, something felt wrong. The usual noises were absent. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just silence. As he neared the tree line, he noticed something strange. Deep scratches ran along the bark of several trees. They were too high to belong to a normal bear cub. They were wide, jagged, unnatural. He knelt down, examining the area. Nearby, a set of tracks led away from his cabin. The strange part was that they started normal, small, the size he would expect from a cub. But as they continued, they changed. The imprints stretched, becoming larger, less defined, almost distorted. A shiver ran down his spine. He stood quickly, scanning his surroundings. The unease in his gut twisted into something sharper. He had the distinct feeling that he was not alone. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his pace quicker than before. Every step felt heavier, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. Inside, the cub had not moved. It remained in the same shadowed corner, its dark eyes fixed on him. He did not want to look at it, did not want to acknowledge the way its presence made his skin prickle. Instead, he busied himself, stoking the fire, preparing a meal, forcing himself to act as if nothing was wrong. But as the hours passed, the tension in the air thickened. That night, as he sat near the fireplace, his thoughts restless, he heard something outside. A noise, low, guttural, almost a growl. He stiffened, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. The sound did not belong to any animal he had ever encountered. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight and stepped toward the window. The glass reflected the interior of his cabin, the dim glow of the fire making it hard to see beyond. But then, just beyond the trees, a shadow shifted. A shape, tall, hunched, just barely out of sight. Daniel's breath caught. He stayed frozen, his heart hammering. The growl came again, this time closer. He took a step back, gripping the flashlight tighter, and then he heard it, something worse than the growl. A whisper, not from outside, from behind him. He spun, his pulse spiking, his eyes locking onto the cub. It had not moved, but something in the air had changed. Daniel knew without a doubt that he had made a terrible mistake. Daniel sat motionless, his breath trapped in his chest. The whisper had been faint, just a thread of sound, but it had come from inside the cabin. His gaze flicked to the cub, still nestled in the corner. It had not moved, yet the weight of its stare was suffocating. The fire crackled behind him, casting shifting shadows across the wooden walls. He wanted to tell himself he had imagined it. That exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Forcing himself to move, he grabbed his flashlight and stood. The whisper had been real, the unnatural silence of the forest, the scratches on the trees, the distorted tracks. Everything pointed to a truth he was not yet ready to face. He took slow steps toward the cub, watching for any sign of movement. It remained still, its dark eyes reflecting the firelight. A sharp gust of wind rattled the window pane. The noise made him flinch, and for a fraction of a second, he looked away. When his eyes returned to the cub, his stomach lurched. It was no longer curled up on the blanket. It was standing. The shift had been silent, unnatural. One moment it had been resting, the next it was on all fours. Its body tensed as if frozen mid-motion. Its head was slightly tilted, its gaze unwavering. The position was unnatural, not like a bear, but like something imitating one. Daniel's pulse pounded. He took a slow step backward. The cub did not react, did not blink. The firelight flickered, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw its shape distort, as if its outline had blurred, shifting in a way that did not belong to this world. His throat tightened. He needed to get out. He moved toward the door, keeping his eyes locked on the cub. His fingers trembled as he reached for the latch. But just as he touched it, a sound filled the room. Not a growl, not a whimper. A voice, low, quiet, not entirely human. "Do not leave." Daniel's hand jerked away from the latch as if burned. His mind screamed at him that this was impossible. The cub had not opened its mouth. The sound had come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His entire body tensed, every instinct telling him to run, to escape. But his feet refused to move. The cub took a single step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, wrong. Its limbs did not bend the way they should. The firelight flickered, and its shadow stretched unnaturally along the floor. Daniel felt his breath shudder as the cabin around him seemed to shrink. The walls pressed inward, the air thick with something unseen. He could not look away. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cub lowered itself back onto the blanket. Its body relaxed, as if nothing had happened. Its eyes closed. The tension in the air broke. The shadows receded. The cabin returned to normal. Daniel stumbled backward, his knees nearly giving out. His mind raced to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it exhaustion? A trick of the firelight? He knew what he had seen, what he had heard, and no amount of denial would change the truth. The cub was not just a bear, and whatever it was watching him. Daniel did not sleep. He sat by the fire, his knife gripped tightly in his hand, eyes locked on the cub. The room was filled with the steady crackling of burning wood, but beyond that, there was only silence. The cub had not moved since its unsettling transformation. Its body curled once more in its resting position. But Daniel knew better. It was not asleep. It was waiting. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on him, but he refused to close his eyes. His mind was racing, trying to rationalize what had happened. Animals did not move like that. They did not whisper. and they certainly did not shift in ways that defied the laws of nature. He needed answers. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Daniel finally moved. His legs ached from sitting for so long, his body tense from hours of fear. He stood slowly, his breath steady but controlled. The cub did not stir. He reached for his backpack and pulled out his old notebook, flipping through the pages until he found an entry he had written months ago. A list of wildlife encounters, strange events in the forest, things the old hunters had told him. One story stood out, a tale passed down by the elders of the nearby town. It spoke of creatures that took the shape of lost animals, mimicking them perfectly to lure humans in. They were not bears, not wolves, not anything of this world. They were something older, something forgotten. The words chilled him. He turned back to the cub, still lying motionless on the blanket. Every instinct screamed at him to get rid of it, to throw open the door and abandon it in the woods. But would that be enough? He had already brought it inside. He had fed it, cared for it. Had he invited it in? A sharp knock at the door jolted him out of his thoughts. The sound was sudden, too loud in the quiet cabin. His heart pounded. He had not seen another person in weeks. No one should be out here. Slowly, he walked toward the door, gripping the knife tighter. He hesitated before opening it, his hand hovering over the latch. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Taking a breath, he pulled the door open. An old man stood outside, his face weathered and lined with age. His eyes were sharp, scanning Daniel before shifting to something inside the cabin. His expression darkened. "You have made a mistake," he said quietly. Daniel's grip on the knife tightened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from a night of silence. The old man did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward, peering past Daniel into the room. "You should not have brought it inside." A cold dread settled over Daniel's chest. He stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. The stranger moved slowly, his gaze fixed on the cub. It still had not moved. "It is not what you think," the old man murmured. "You need to get rid of it. Now." Daniel swallowed hard. "What is it?" he whispered. The old man exhaled heavily, his eyes never leaving the creature. "It does not belong in this world." A sudden sound made both men freeze. A whisper, low and deliberate. The cub had not moved, but the voice was there, threading through the air like a breath of wind. Daniel's skin crawled. The old man took a step back, his face grim. "You have until nightfall," he said. "After that, it will no longer pretend." Daniel turned to him, but the man was already moving toward the door. His steps were quick, urgent. Panic tightened in Daniel's throat. "What happens after nightfall?" he demanded. The old man paused at the threshold, his fingers tightening on the frame. "It will show you what it truly is." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the trees as if he had never been there at all. Daniel shut the door, his breath unsteady. He turned back to the cub, dread settling deep in his gut. The fire had burned lower, the shadows growing longer. The cub opened its eyes, and it smiled. Daniel's breath hitched as he took a slow step back. The cub, no, the thing was still curled on the blanket, but its expression had changed. A smile, not a snarl, not a natural movement of an animal's mouth, but something deliberate, something conscious. It was subtle, barely there, but unmistakable. The fire flickered, and for a moment, the creature's shadow stretched unnaturally across the wooden floor. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs remained frozen. His mind raced, replaying the old man's warning. He had until nightfall. After that, it would no longer pretend. The weight of those words settled into his chest like lead. He had already wasted half the day. Forcing himself to move, he grabbed his pack and stuffed it with supplies. His knife, flashlight, water, anything that might help. His only thought was to get as far away from the cabin as possible. Maybe if he left it here, whatever it was would stay behind. Maybe he had not crossed the point of no return. The creature did not react as he moved. It just lay there, watching. Daniel avoided looking at it, focusing on getting to the door. His fingers fumbled at the latch, but he managed to yank it open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth. Without hesitating, he stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. The forest stretched before him, dark and endless. The path to the main road was miles away, but he knew the direction. If he kept moving, he could make it by nightfall. He tightened the straps of his pack and started walking. His boots crunched against the forest floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. With every step, his heartbeat slowed. The farther he got from the cabin, the lighter he felt. Maybe it would be that easy. Maybe he had not let it sink its claws into him yet. The thought was comforting. Then he heard it, a whisper, not behind him, not from the cabin. Ahead, his steps faltered. The trees loomed taller, their shadows stretching toward him. He turned his flashlight on, sweeping it across the path. Nothing, just trees and endless darkness. Then the whisper came again. This time it was closer. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He took another step forward, his fingers tightening around the handle of his knife. The air grew colder, thick with something unseen. His flashlight flickered. He smacked it against his palm, trying to steady the beam, but the light sputtered. Then just beyond the glow of his flashlight, something moved. A shape, a figure. He stopped breathing. It was standing between the trees, too still, too tall. Its form was wrong, stretched, elongated, like something wearing a human shape, but not quite understanding how it was supposed to move. Then it took a step forward. The movement was slow, unnatural. Its limbs did not bend the way they should. The whisper grew louder, threading through the trees, wrapping around him like a voice just beneath the surface of a dream. Daniel stumbled back. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The figure took another step, the darkness shifting around it like a living thing. Then slowly it tilted its head and smiled. Daniel turned and ran. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he did not stop. The whisper followed him, crawling through the air, curling against the back of his neck. The forest blurred past him, but the path stretched endlessly ahead, as if he was running in place. Then, without warning, the whisper stopped. Silence crashed down around him, heavy and absolute. He skidded to a halt, chest heaving. Then he saw it. He was standing in front of his cabin, his stomach twisted violently. He had been running for miles, he had been moving forward, but he was right back where he started. The door stood open, the fire still crackling inside, and sitting on the blanket, exactly where he had left it, was the cub. Its black eyes locked onto his, and it grinned wider. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling in frantic rhythm. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. He had run. He had moved forward. There was no possible way he could have ended up back here, but he had. And the thing was waiting for him. The cub, or whatever it was, sat exactly where he had left it, its body still, its grin unnatural. The fire cast flickering shadows along the walls, making its shape appear to shift ever so slightly, as if it were not fully solid. The moment stretched endlessly, the silence pressing against his ears. Then, as if sensing his realization, the creature moved. Slowly, deliberately, it rose to its feet. Its limbs unfolded with a quiet grace, too precise, too calculated. Daniel took an involuntary step back. The door to the cabin remained open behind him, the threshold a thin barrier between him and the thing that had been pretending to be an animal. His fingers tightened around his knife. His brain screamed at him to run, to flee into the woods, even if the path was cursed to bring him back here. But his body would not move. The creature tilted its head. Then in a slow, careful movement, it took a step forward. Daniel's breath hitched, his body tensed, every muscle screaming. Then it spoke. Not a whisper this time. A voice that almost sounded human. "You should not have taken me." Daniel's entire body went cold. The words were soft, measured, almost gentle. But beneath them was something deeper, something ancient. The voice carried no emotion, no hint of malice or threat, just a simple statement of fact. He could not breathe, could not blink. The creature took another step. Its shape flickered, the edges of its body stretching and twisting in the firelight. Its features no longer resembled a cub. Its form was changing, lengthening, unraveling into something he could not comprehend. Daniel stumbled back, his foot catching on the doorstep. He fell onto the ground outside, his palms scraping against the rough wood. His knife slipped from his grip, clattering against the floor. The thing stepped over the threshold. "You invited me in," it murmured. Daniel scrambled backward, his body moving on instinct. The air around him thickened, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. The night itself seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing the trees, the sky, the very world around him. The creature took another step. The last of its animal form melted away, its limbs elongating, its posture straightening into something grotesquely human-like, but wrong in every possible way. Its face remained empty, its grin stretching too wide. "You fed me." Daniel's stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to shut his eyes, to pretend this was not happening, but he could not look away. The fire in the cabin flickered violently, its glow illuminating the thing that had been wearing the skin of a bear cub. Its body rippled, shifting, adapting. It was still changing, still becoming. Daniel tried to move, to crawl, to run, but the moment his hand touched the ground, he felt it. The earth beneath him was not earth anymore. It pulsed. It breathed. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He had not just taken something into his cabin, he had taken it into himself. The thing was no longer just in front of him. It was everywhere. The trees, the ground, the air. It had never needed to chase him. It had never needed to force him to stay, because he had never left. Not really. A deep, slow understanding settled in his bones. It had never been about the cub. It had been about him. The moment he picked it up, the moment he carried it, fed it, kept it near, he had allowed it in, and now it was part of him. The creature knelt, its grotesque form towering over him, its two wide grins stretching in quiet amusement. Then in a voice that was almost comforting, almost kind, it whispered, "You were mine the moment you touched me." The last thing Daniel saw was the world folding inward, the trees vanishing, the stars blinking out one by one, and then there was nothing. Nothing at all. If you found this story thrilling, make sure to subscribe for more gripping tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support helps bring more suspenseful and chilling narratives to life. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the eerie twists, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for more mysterious and haunting stories, because sometimes the unknown is closer than you think.